Could we crash out of the EU without a deal? The Brexit negotiations are deadlocked and time is running out to secure an agreement. Some Brexiteers believe the demands of the EU 27 are so unreasonable we would be better abandoning the talks. Theresa May has always said that no deal is better than a bad deal, but is she right? Here's what could happen if we walked away from the Brexit talks. Trade would be paralyzed. Free trade with the EU would halt immediately. Image Getty. The UK would be out of the single market and the customs union. Free trade with the EU, our largest trading partner, and dozens of other countries would halt immediately. EU economies, which have a trade surplus with the UK, would be hurt too. Britain would have to fall back on World Trade Organization rules, which would mean 10% tariffs on car exports, 22% tariffs on lorries and up to 40% on some agricultural goods. The Institute for Fiscal Studies think tank says that trade with the EU would fall by as much as 29%, costing the UK economy between £48.6 billion and £58 billion, the equivalent to between £741 and £884 per person. The Treasury is equally pessimistic, saying it could cost 800,000 jobs, cut GDP by 6% and see the pound fall by 15%. Business would face extra costs. Nissan has warned it could add millions of pounds to its costs. Image Getty. The boss of Nissan, Colin Lawther, has said leaving the customs union would be a disaster for the firm. He told MPs that falling back on World Trade Organization (WTO) rules would cost the firm £500 million a year in extra import and export duties and could see it have to scale back its production. Financial services, our biggest sector, would lose their passporting rights, which allow them to sell products across the EU without having to get individual licenses in each country. Tens of thousands of jobs could go in banking, insurance and trading. The Financial Conduct Authority says 5,476 British firms rely on passporting rights. Food prices will rise. The chairman of Sainsbury's, David Tyler, has warned the cost of the weekly shop will rise if there's no deal. Tyler also warns the checks at customs see below would lead to delays, the risk of empty supermarket shelves and increased food waste. The Resolution Foundation says a no deal would see tariffs on imports of dairy products from the EU will rise by 45%, on meat products by 37%, and on clothing, footwear, beverages and tobacco by 10%. This will have a significant effect on living standard of the poorest households, with 3 million families seeing price rises of over £500 a year. Millions will be left in limbo. Tens of thousands of Brits living in the EU could be forced to come home. Image Getty. The status of 3.2 million EU nationals in the UK and the 1 million UK nationals in the EU would be thrown into uncertainty. British citizens overseas could lose their entitlement overnight to free emergency healthcare. The NHS Confederation says that without health cover, tens of thousands of British pensioners would be forced to return home, putting an added strain of £500 million a year on the NHS. Travelers would face queues at ports and airports, and in the worst-case scenario, we could need visas to travel to EU countries. UK travelers in the EU could face immediate roaming charges. Queues at customs and airports. Drivers would face long queues at ports. Image Reuters. All lorries leaving and arriving at Britain's ports would be subject to customs checks. At the moment, more than 10,000 lorries a day pass through Dover and 6,000 by the Channel Tunnel. Experts say at least 20 square km of land needs to be set aside at each major port to cater for hauliers waiting clearance. The delays have a knock-on effect for firms, with some car components crossing the channel 30 times before final assembly. We would also need thousands more border staff, but they take at least a year to train. The head of the National Audit Office, Sir Amy Morse, has warned of a horror show at borders if we crash out without a deal. Security arrangements would be put at risk. It could be harder to extradite suspects from overseas. Image Getty. A big question mark would be placed over our membership of several EU police and security arrangements. We could lose access to the European arrest warrant, which allows the extradition of terrorists, murderers, rapists and pedophiles, and sharing of cross-border intelligence. The UK would also leave the European Defence Agency and lose access to the Schengen and PRIM databases, which store DNA, fingerprint and vehicle information, and holds traveller information from the passenger name record system. Northern Ireland peace process would be put in jeopardy. Drivers would face checks on the Northern Ireland border. Image Getty. Crashing out without a deal has serious implications for Northern Ireland and the peace process. It could require the imposition of a hard border with the Republic, which could inflame Republican tensions and lead to a rise in smuggling. Businesses and commuters would be severely disrupted. An estimated 30,000 people commute across the border each day and 177,000 lorries each month. Would flights be grounded? The industry is divided on whether flights would be grounded. Getty Images. There are conflicting views on whether flights will be grounded if we leave without a deal. At the moment, airlines and aerospace manufacturers are overseen the European Aviation Safety Agency. The Airport Operators Association says that if we leave the EU without a deal, there is no equivalent for the industry of falling back to World Trade Organization rules. It warns that unless this legal vacuum is addressed, flights could be stopped. Ryanair has also warned flights could grounded, but other airlines are less pessimistic. We could lose access to life-saving medicines. Pharma companies have warned of delays. Getty. Leaving the EU nuclear agency Euratom threatens the supply of radioactive isotopes used in scans and radiation treatment. Pharma companies warned delays at borders could pose a serious threat to supplies of life-saving medicines. Drug firms could have to move out of the UK in order to keep their EU licenses for products. Professor Martin Mickey, of the London School of Hygiene Tropical Medicine, has said no deal scenario would be potentially catastrophic for the NHS. Are there any positives? John Longworth says we could thrive outside the EU. Sky News. Brexiteers claim we would be off the hook for the £12 billion a year we pay the EU. But if we fail to settle our divorce bill, it will make it harder to strike a future trade deal with Brussels. Brexiteer John Longworth has also claimed we would no longer be subject to EU red tape and free from EU tariffs applied to the rest of the world. This could boost our economy by £120 billion, he argues. But this would only be the case if we strike trade deals with non-EU countries that compensate for the loss of access to the single market. It would also require the UK to become a low-tax, low-regulation country, threatening investment in public services and the scrapping of workers' rights. Pascal Lamy, the former Director General of the WTO, has said, to fall back on WTO rules would be a terrible replacement for access to the EU single market.